When Tasha K says she has receipts, the internet doesn't lean in for gossip. It braces for context. And this time, the context didn't arrive loud. It arrived layered. Timelines, overlaps, questions that don't disappear once they're asked. Because according to Tasha K, this was never about a single clip or a viral moment. It was about pieces that only make sense once you stop looking at them one by one. And when she suggested those pieces involved Claressa Shields, the tone around the story shifted immediately. Fans didn't just debate what was said, they rewatched what had already happened. Old interviews felt heavier, past reactions felt sharper. Silence started sounding intentional. Tasha didn't rush to show anything. She didn't need to. The claim alone, that documentation exists, was enough to deepen the controversy. Because when someone says they've verified quietly, off camera, away from timelines, the question becomes less about proof and more about why now. And Claressa's response only intensified the split. Supporters say she's being targeted unfairly, forced to defend herself against a narrative she never agreed to participate in. Critics say the pressure is visible, that reactions this strong don't come from nowhere. They come from stakes. What made this moment combustible wasn't just the claim of receipts. It was the imbalance that followed. One side escalating, the other side slowing everything down. And in that space, the audience filled the silence with interpretation. Because when receipts are promised but not revealed, controversy doesn't fade. It deepens. Stay locked in. Because once receipts are mentioned, the story isn't about what's shown next. It's about what can't be unseen once the pattern is recognized. When Tasha K said she had receipts, the conversation around Claressa Shields didn't just get louder, it got heavier. Because in internet culture, receipts don't just imply evidence, they imply process. Time spent verifying, cross-checking, sitting with information before deciding to speak. And that implication alone was enough to deepen the controversy. According to Tasha K's framing, this wasn't a story that arrived all at once. It unfolded in fragments, overlapping moments that didn't align cleanly, statements that made sense individually, but felt different when placed side by side. She didn't rush to display anything publicly. She emphasized that whatever she referenced had been reviewed quietly, away from timelines and comment sections. That detail mattered. Because when someone claims verification happened off camera, the focus shifts from spectacle to credibility. Viewers stop asking, "Is this messy?" and start asking, "How long did this take to confirm?" For Claressa, this created a new kind of pressure. Up until this point, the narrative could still be framed as commentary versus reaction, opinions versus emotion. But the moment receipts entered the conversation, the stakes changed, not because proof was shown, but because the promise of proof restructured the debate. Fans reacted immediately. Supporters of Claressa saw the phrase receipts as a provocation, a tactic used to escalate attention without accountability. In their view, this was unfair pressure placed on a public figure who had already chosen to respond emotionally rather than litigate claims in public. Others saw it differently. They argued that the mention of receipts didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It suggested context existed that the public hadn't seen yet. And once that idea took hold, the internet did what it always does. It went backward. Old clips were rewatched. Previous statements were replayed. Moments that once felt normal were reinterpreted. This is where stories become dangerous, not because of what's added, but because of what's reframed. According to media analysts, controversy deepens most when new information isn't revealed, but existing information is repositioned. Tasha K didn't need to show anything to change how people watched Claressa's reactions. See, the mere suggestion that documentation existed shifted perception. Claressa's response to this escalation was sharp and visible, not chaotic, focused, defensive, charged. She addressed the narrative directly, rejecting implications and asserting control over her own story. To many, this looked like strength. To others, it looked like containment. Containment doesn't imply guilt. It implies urgency. The urgency to prevent a narrative from expanding beyond a certain boundary. And that urgency becomes noticeable when reactions intensify as the story grows more structured. This is where the controversy deepened. Not because anyone proved anything, but because the emotional temperature rose at the same time the narrative slowed down. One side escalated in tone. The other emphasized patience, verification, and restraint. And then there was the silence. The absence of extended clarification from others connected to the situation became a story of its own. No timelines offered, no long explanations, just minimal engagement. In public storytelling, silence following a claim of receipts is rarely read as neutrality. It's read as calculation. Calculation doesn't confirm or deny. It delays. It waits to see where perception settles. Tasha K. leaned into that dynamic carefully. She didn't say silence meant guilt. She said silence often appears when speaking would create more questions than answers. When clarity risks contradiction. And that framing resonated. Because clarity invites comparison. Comparison invites contradiction. Contradiction extends controversy. So the story entered a holding pattern. One fueled not by new facts, but by anticipation. Would receipts be shown? Would the narrative shift again? Would reactions escalate or fade? For Claressa, this meant navigating a narrowing path. Every response carried weight. Speak again and risk amplifying speculation. Stay silent and risk letting others frame the meaning of that silence. This is the uncomfortable middle phase of any high-profile controversy, the moment when no option feels neutral anymore. And it's why Part 1 matters. Because this wasn't about what was proven. It was about what was suggested, and how suggestion alone can alter the trajectory of a public narrative. By the end of this phase, one thing was undeniable. The controversy had deepened not because of evidence, but because of expectation. Expectation that more existed. Expectation that silence was intentional. Expectation that reactions were meaningful. Once expectations form, stories don't need momentum. They sustain themselves. And that's where this story paused. Not resolved, not exploded, but tightened. Waiting to see whether anticipation would be met with confirmation, denial, or something quieter and more consequential. Once Tasha K. said the word receipts, the story entered a psychological phase that has nothing to do with screenshots and everything to do with anticipation. According to media analysts, this is the moment when a controversy stops being driven by information and starts being driven by expectation. And expectation is volatile. Tasha K. didn't post documents. She didn't roll clips. She didn't flood timelines with proof. Instead, she emphasized process, quiet verification, cross-checking timelines, sitting with information before speaking. That framing alone shifted the burden of interpretation onto the audience. Because when receipts are promised, but not shown, the question becomes less, is this true? And more, what would make someone confident enough to say this out loud? That subtle shift matters. For Claressa Shields, this created a different kind of pressure than a standard rumor cycle. Rumors can be dismissed. Claims framed as verified context demand response strategy. Do you address the implication head-on? Do you wait it out? Do you challenge credibility or refuse to participate? Each option carries risk. Fans split quickly along familiar lines. Supporters argued that promising receipts without releasing them is manipulative, an attention tactic designed to provoke reaction without accountability. In their view, Claressa's sharp response was justified, even necessary to prevent speculation from hardening into belief. Skeptics focused on the opposite. They argued that promising receipts signals confidence, not chaos. That people who bluff usually overshare. People who are certain slow things down. From that angle, Tasha K.'s restraint looked intentional, even strategic. This is where the story deepened, not because anyone proved anything, but because the tempo changed. Tempo tells you how a narrative is being managed. Claressa's tempo was fast, immediate, direct, emotionally present. Tasha K.'s tempo was slow, measured, detached, process-oriented. Neither approach confirms truth or falsehood. but together they created a contrast the audience couldn't ignore. In public storytelling, contrast invites judgment. The faster voice is often read as reactive. The slower voice is often read as confident. That's not fair, but it's common. And this contrast intensified because of what didn't happen next. There were no sweeping clarifications from others connected to the story. No detailed timelines to neutralize speculation. Just continued restraint, minimal engagement, strategic distance. According to narrative analysts, this is when silence becomes directional. It doesn't just pause a story, it guides how people think about what might come next. People start asking, if receipts are real, will they be released? If they aren't released, why mention them at all? Who benefits from waiting? These questions don't require answers to circulate. They live in comments, reaction videos, and quiet assumptions. Tasha K leaned into this phase carefully. She didn't escalate language. She didn't add accusations. She reiterated process, verification, patience, and patience, in moments like this, can read as power. For Claressa, patience was harder to perform. Public figures under implied scrutiny often feel compelled to defend identity, not just facts. And identity defense is emotional by nature. When your character feels reframed by someone else, urgency follows. That urgency doesn't prove guilt, but it does reveal stakes, and stakes are what audiences respond to. Part 2 is where the internet stopped asking for evidence and started assigning meaning to tone, pacing, and restraint. People compared body language, vocal delivery, timing of posts. Not because those things prove anything, but because they feel revealing. This is the danger zone of implied evidence. Once anticipation takes over, even silence becomes content. Silence can be read as confidence. Silence can be read as calculation. Silence can be read as avoidance. And which interpretation sticks depends on who the audience already trusts. By the end of this phase, the controversy no longer needed new claims to survive. It was sustained by waiting to see if receipts would surface, waiting to see if reactions would escalate or fade, waiting to see who would blink first. That's why Part 2 matters. Because this is the phase where stories harden, not around facts, but around beliefs formed in absence. And once beliefs set in, even truth struggles to dislodge them. The controversy didn't deepen because of proof. It deepened because of promise. And promises, when left hanging, change how every previous moment is remembered. By the time this controversy entered its third phase, seized the loudest force wasn't accusation. It was anticipation. According to observers, once Tasha K suggested receipts existed, the narrative stopped asking for proof and started measuring time. Time since the claim. Time between responses. Time spent not clarifying. And time, when paired with silence, creates pressure. This is the phase where stories evolve without new information. Nothing needs to be added for momentum to continue. The audience fills gaps with interpretation, and interpretation becomes belief. Not because it's accurate, but because it's repeated. For Claressa Shields, this phase felt different from the earlier reaction cycle. In the beginning, responding quickly felt necessary, like reclaiming agency. But anticipation flips the math. Each additional response risks validating the weight itself. Speak again. And you confirm the story's importance. Stay quiet, and you allow others to decide what quiet means. That's the bind. Anticipation-driven narratives punish certainty. The more confident you sound, the more people listen for cracks. The calmer you appear, the more people wonder what's being managed. Either way, tone becomes evidence in the court of public opinion. According to media psychologists, anticipation is most powerful when paired with asymmetry. One side slows down, while the other side feels compelled to explain. That asymmetry was visible here. Tasha K emphasized process and patience. Claressa emphasized identity and boundaries. Neither approach confirms truth, but together they shape perception. And perception sticks. As days passed, the internet stopped asking, "Where are the receipts?" and started asking, "Why hasn't anything been denied in detail?" That question is unfair, but common. Detailed denial invites timelines. Timelines invite comparisons. Comparisons invite contradictions. So restraint becomes tempting. This is where silence changes meaning again. Earlier, silence functioned as a shield. Now, silence functions as context. Viewers read it alongside prior reactions and promised verification. The story becomes less about documents and more about what behavior suggests under pressure. Supporters of Claressa argued that anticipation itself is manipulative, that dangling proof without release is designed to provoke. From this view, refusing to engage further is the only rational choice. Don't feed the cycle, let it starve. Skeptics argued the opposite. They said waiting looks intentional, that people confident in their position don't rush. They let attention mature. They let others talk themselves into corners. Both interpretations can't be true at once, but both can coexist online. That's why anticipation is dangerous. It polarizes without resolving. Another shift happened in this phase: memory editing. Viewers began retrofitting earlier moments with new meaning. A pause in an interview, a clipped answer, a defensive tone months ago. None of these moments prove anything, but anticipation invites rereading. Once rereading starts, neutrality disappears. Tasha K didn't need to escalate to maintain this phase. The promise of receipts did the work for her. Reiterating verification kept the clock running, and every tick amplified stakes. For Claressa, the stakes weren't just reputational. They were identity-based. Champions are expected to be composed. When composure looks like calculation, audiences question sincerity. When emotion appears, audiences question control. Anticipation weaponizes that double standard. This is also the phase where fatigue sets in. Not boredom, fatigue. Audiences grow tired of waiting without closure, and fatigue turns into judgment. People decide what they believe so they can move on. And once people decide, they don't need proof. Analysts call this the belief lock. Once locked, new information is filtered through existing assumptions. Receipts released later won't land neutrally. They'll be interpreted to confirm what people already think. That's the paradox of anticipation. It can make proof less effective. By the end of Part 3, the controversy had changed shape again. It wasn't escalating. It was hardening. The narrative settled into two camps with different readings of the same behaviors. Silence meant strength to one side and evasion to the other. Reaction meant honesty to one side and pressure to the other. No new facts were needed. And that's why this phase matters. Because once anticipation becomes the engine, control slips from everyone involved. The story moves on rails built by tone, timing, and trust, not truth alone. By this stage, the controversy around Claressa Shields had reached a strange turning point. Not louder, not messier, quieter, but heavier. According to media analysts, this is the phase where anticipation stops fueling curiosity and starts creating exhaustion. And exhaustion changes behavior. At first, waiting feels intentional, strategic, almost powerful. But over time, seeing anticipation reaches a ceiling. When nothing new appears, no receipts released, no detailed clarifications, no direct confrontations, the audience's attention shifts from what's coming to why nothing is happening. That's when anticipation begins to collapse under its own weight. For Tasha K, this phase didn't require escalation. Her earlier framing, verification, patience, process, had already done the work. She didn't need to add details to keep the story alive. The absence of resolution itself became content. For Claressa, however, this phase demanded a different calculation. Reactions no longer reset the narrative. Silence no longer pauses it. Every option carried diminishing returns. If she spoke again, critics would say she was feeding the cycle. If she stayed quiet, others would say the quiet meant something had shifted behind the scenes. This is the point where public figures realize that control has limits. Once anticipation hardens into belief, no response lands cleanly. Observers began noticing distance, not disappearance, but disengagement. Fewer direct responses, less reinforcement of earlier positions, a gradual redirection of focus. Not avoidance, but recalibration. This is how many stories actually wind down. Not with statements, not with proof, but with movement away from the center. Analysts describe this as the distance phase. It's when participants stop trying to win the narrative and start trying to exit it with the least long-term damage. Distance doesn't admit guilt or innocence. It admits cost. The cost of staying engaged had grown too high. So another dynamic intensified during this phase: the reading of behavior. With words exhausted, audiences began reading energy. Who seemed calmer? Who seemed finished talking? Who seemed invested in closure? And who seemed ready to let the story fade? This is where silence takes on its final meaning. Earlier, silence was strategy. Then it became anticipation. Now it became direction. Silence started signaling where attention would, and wouldn't, be placed going forward. For Claressa, this meant allowing time to do what arguments couldn't. Let attention drift. Let new moments replace old ones. Let the controversy lose oxygen rather than explode. And for the audience, this felt anticlimactic. People want endings, they want confirmation or denial. But real-life narratives rarely provide either. They end with unanswered questions and changed behavior. And that's uncomfortable, because discomfort invites speculation long after headlines move on. This is also where belief locks in. By now, most viewers had already decided what they thought. Not based on receipts, but based on tone, timing, and restraint. Once decisions are made, new information doesn't change minds easily. It just gets filtered. That's why anticipation eventually stops being useful. The promise of receipts loses power once people stop waiting for them. When anticipation collapses, what remains is impression, and impressions are stubborn. By the end of Part 4, the controversy wasn't escalating anymore. It was settling into memory, into reference points, into remember when territory. And that's how stories survive quietly, by becoming context for how future actions are interpreted. This phase matters because it shows the limit of public narratives. There's a point where explanation, defense, and anticipation all fail to deliver closure. What remains is distance as resolution. And distance doesn't answer questions. It replaces them. By the time this controversy reached its final phase, something important had already happened. The story stopped chasing attention. Instead, attention began deciding where it would land next. That's how most real-life celebrity narratives conclude. Not with explosions, not with confessions, but with quiet repositioning. At this stage, the situation involving Claressa Shields and commentary from Tasha K was no longer about receipts or reactions. It was about impact. Impact lingers longer than proof. Media analysts often describe 3 possible endings to moments like this: fade, fracture, or reset. All 3 can look similar on the surface, but they mean very different things beneath it. The fade happens when attention slowly migrates elsewhere. No closure, no confirmation, just replacement. New stories rise, algorithms move on, and the controversy becomes background noise. But fading doesn't mean forgetting. It means the narrative becomes a reference point rather than a headline. It gets remembered when similar situations arise. This reminds me of that time when the fracture happens when audiences split permanently. One group believes one version, another believes the opposite. There's no bridge between them. Each new action by the people involved is interpreted differently depending on which side you're on. Fractures don't heal easily, they just stabilize. The reset is the rarest outcome. It requires time, consistency, and a shift in focus so strong that it rewrites context. Not denial, not explanation, replacement, new accomplishments, new narratives, new visibility that reframes the past instead of arguing with it. Observers noted that this situation leaned toward a fade-fracture hybrid. No dramatic escalation followed. No definitive reveal closed the loop. Instead, what settled in was interpretation. People decided what they believed based on behavior patterns, not documentation. And once belief settles, it becomes resistant to change. This is where silence delivers its final message. Earlier in the story, silence meant strategy. Then it meant anticipation. Now it means direction and endurance. Silence here isn't passive, it's selective. It says, this is no longer where energy is going. And for public figures, energy placement matters more than statements. Where someone shows up next tells you what they consider worth protecting. For Claressa, this phase emphasized forward motion, not to erase the controversy, but to reduce its gravitational pull. Every appearance, every focus shift, every moment that doesn't reference the story slowly recalibrates public memory. For Tasha K., the impact phase didn't require follow-ups. The claim itself had already reshaped how audiences interpreted prior events. Sometimes influence comes not from what's proven, but from what changes how people look back. That's the quiet power of commentary. Another key aspect of this final phase is trust recalibration. Audiences don't just judge facts, they judge alignment. Who feels consistent over time? Who feels reactive? Who appears to be managing emotion versus absorbing it? These judgments are subjective, but they stick. And once they stick, they influence future narratives. This is why stories like this don't truly end. They become context. Context for future reactions. Context for future controversies. Context for how quickly people believe or doubt the next claim. That's the real aftermath. Not damage, not vindication, but permanent repositioning in the public mind. The most important takeaway from this phase is simple. Absence of closure doesn't equal absence of consequence. Even without receipts released or detailed rebuttals issued, the situation left a mark. It changed how audiences interpret silence, emotion, and restraint from everyone involved. And that's why these stories matter beyond entertainment. They reveal how modern narratives operate, how belief forms without confirmation, how attention decides truth before evidence arrives, and how silence can mean strength to one group and evasion to another. By the end of Part 5, one thing is clear. This was never just about what was said. It was about what people did afterward. And behavior, over time, becomes its own form of evidence in the court of public opinion. No verdict was delivered, no gavel dropped, but impressions were locked in. And in today's media landscape, impressions outlive headlines. So now it's on you, not to pick sides, not to rush to judgment, but to sit with what this story really showed us. Because when the noise fades and the clips stop circulating, what's left isn't proof, it's impression. And impressions are powerful. They shape how we interpret every move that comes next. Was this controversy fueled by facts or by timing? Did silence protect dignity or protect distance? And when reactions slow down, does that mean resolution or simply a shift in strategy? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most real stories don't end with answers. They end with people deciding what they believe based on behavior, tone, and consistency over time. That's what makes moments like this linger. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did this story fade naturally, or was it intentionally redirected? Who controlled the narrative in the end? And do you think silence speaks louder than receipts in today's media landscape? If this breakdown made you pause, share it. If it challenged your assumptions, subscribe. And if you're still watching, it's because you know there's more happening beneath the surface than any headline can explain. Stay locked in, stay observant. Because the real stories aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that quietly change how we see everything that follows.